Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're actually going to start the breakdown of the little Suzuki TS50 engine. Pretty much got everything ready to go here up on my main workbench. As you can see, I've got some of my tools are right here ready to go. I have my service manual handy and opened up to the appropriate sections in case I need to reference it. I'll just keep that off to the side so I don't get it dirty. Impact driver that I will use to, probably have to use anyway to get some of these fasteners out. And of course, my beverage of choice. I work in the early mornings on this kind of thing, so this is strong coffee to keep me going. I'll need more tools than this, I'm sure, before it's over, such as a puller for the rotor on the flywheel when we get to it, but this will be enough to get me started. Before we get too much further, though, I did want to talk about driver bits a bit. This is just an extension, this removable bit, as you can see there. The Japanese bikes of this era used a cross-recessed, or many people call it a Phillips, that is a specific type, and this is a JIS, or Japanese Industrial Standard specification, and it uses a unique bit. And many folks, I don't believe, even are aware of that. Most of us in our past, when we've worked on these bikes, we've found these many times, these case screws, side cover screws are all buggered up and beat up and rounded off. And many of the reasons that happens is people use a standard Phillips or cross recess like this, and this just happens to be a P2, that's a size. I don't know if you can see that on there. This is just a standard Phillips drive, which appears to fit. The problem is it's not appropriate, it's not right, and it actually doesn't fit right. You really need to use JIS designed bits for these kind of screws. I have a full set of JIS, both not only screwdrivers, and that's what this is right here. This black handle is a JIS screwdriver. I have a full set of these, as well as different sizes of removable bits such as this that I can put in an extension. So I always make sure to use JIS tools when removing these Phillips or cross recess style fasteners, otherwise you will bugger them up. Now most of these don't seem to be too bad. I think this right cover has been off before, but they didn't do too bad a job of getting it off previously, I don't think, because they didn't damage the screws too much. There's a little bit of evidence of rounding, especially if you're going to use impact tools, which I will be very likely using. My Makita here, this is a great impact driver. Impact tools with standard Phillips cross recess will round those off in a heartbeat, so you really need to be careful. I also don't use anything too oversized. You'll notice it's just a small 1/4 inch drive. Most of the time, I find, especially on smaller engines like this, I don't need 3/8 or 1/2 inch drive tools. I use the smallest tools I can get away with when I do something like this. Onto the engine. I have removed some of the covers already, or some of the items already. I removed the little metal shield or cover that goes over the oil pump right here. I've obviously not removed the oil pump. We'll get to that a little bit later. So that cover's come off. I've removed a couple of grommets, pulled the oil filler plug out here. Of course, the carburetor came off some time ago. So it's been relatively stripped of the ancillary items. Now we're going to go ahead and actually start the breakdown of the engine. Where I'm going to start is with removing the cylinder head and cylinder piston, get that out of the way, and then we'll move over to the left side of the engine and we'll start on getting the flywheel rotor off, getting this side cover off, and we're going to work our way into the engine gradually. I did do some quick checking, and it appears that most of the bearings and seals for the internals of the engine, that being the crankshaft, the crankcase bearings and seals, are still available from Suzuki, which will make it a little easier for me. I'm probably going to get all the way in and end up pulling the crankshaft out and checking the bearings. If the bearing's okay, I'll leave those alone and leave them on the crank, but the seals certainly, while I'm in there, will be replaced. But most of the parts do seem to still be available from Suzuki, and in fact, they're still listed as available through Suzuki. So that will be likely the avenue I will go if I get in that far, which I probably will. So we're just going to go ahead now and start removing. I've not removed this yet. I did have the head off. Well, let me clarify. Nothing has been loosened up at this point, except for this head I did have off earlier when I wanted to check the piston. So I've had the head off, but it's tightened back on right now. So I'm expecting this head should pop right off. Not only did I have it off, but I think I mentioned the previous owner that I bought it from had put a new piston in it. And so obviously he had to have it all apart to do that. You notice I loosened those nuts in a crisscross pattern. Probably not absolutely critical on this little engine at this point. I do that out of habit. There's the cylinder head. And again, I don't know if you can see it right there. You can see the evidence of the helicoil the previous owner put in, and I'm not sure they did that just right, so that's why I got that different head. That's actually a new head gasket the previous owner put in. You can tell that's brand new. So now it's going to be a matter of, see if I can rotate this. See the piston right there, I think. He did install it correctly with the arrow. There's an arrow right there pointing towards the exhaust. We're going to go ahead now and just slide this right off. And there's the cylinder. So you can tell by looking at that's a new piston. It's got a 1.0 stamped on it. I don't know if you can see that, but that means it's 1 millimeter over, which is the maximum on this particular engine. So what we're going to do now, I'm just need to look in here. Let me get my flashlight. A second. There's those little circlips in there, in here that I need to get out, one on each side, and push the piston pin out, and then we can remove the piston itself. There's one. Got the engine turned around. Try to keep my head out of the way here, and I'm going to again grab that little circlip right there, like that, and just leverage it right out, like that. Now, theoretically, this piston pin should come out pretty easy because he's had it out before. Let me see if I can get a bigger screwdriver. Just push that right out. So there's the piston, new rings. I'm guessing this is probably new as well. So I'll just set those parts aside. Now we can see the bearing, upper end bearing. That's probably new also. And the connecting rod right there. Next thing I'm going to do is pull this flywheel rotor off the left end of the crankshaft. These can be an absolute bear to get off, and it's almost impossible to get most of them off without a puller, and I think I have the right size puller. If not, I'll have to sort that out in a few minutes when I get there. I'm going to have to lock the crankshaft from turning, because obviously I've got to remove that nut, and that's going to want to, as I rotate that nut counterclockwise like this, it's going to want to rotate the crankshaft, and I have to prevent that from happening. So I'm going to block this with something like this. Here in a minute I'll show you that. You don't have to get real sophisticated with that. And then we'll turn the engine around where I can get at this, this nut on the end. So let me reset this up just a little bit and we'll be right back. I want to share with you my little basic setup to hold that connecting rod. Just took a piece of old vinyl tubing I had around. I've got probably yards and yards of this stuff stuffed away. This has been used before for probably fuel transfer. That's why it's changed in color. It starts getting stiff, but I keep it around for things like this. I just cut a section of that to length, took a big heavy screwdriver. I slit the tubing this way so that I could slip it over the shank of the screwdriver. That's to protect the cases here and the inside of the connecting rod. Don't have to do anything over here because this is plastic. And as I rotate that nut and that connecting rod wants to turn, this screwdriver will prevent that from happening. I've got a 17 millimeter socket. That's what this nut is over here. That's a 17 millimeter. And my impact driver set in reverse. What I'm going to do now is apply a little heat here. I don't know how long it's been since this has been off, so I'm going to get my heat gun and I'm going to heat this up, this whole assembly here. I don't use an open flame for something like this because there's wiring and such behind there, so I'll use the heat gun, get it good and hot, and then we'll try to remove it. Okay, I got that good and hot. It's too hot to the touch. I'm going to use my impact driver set in reverse. I'm going to hit it hard and fast. This is not one of those things you try to finesse, I found. It's easier, I think, just to hit it hard and fast, and if you do it right, quite often it'll just pop, the fastener will pop loose. I do have safety glasses on, by the way. And there's the nut. And there's a lock washer in it. That's a little hot. A little lock washer in there. Now, in all fairness, it looks like this nut has been off before. Like I said, that's kind of hot. So that might have made it a little easier for us. But now you can see why I had this all rigged up here to prevent that from turning when I hit it with that impact. Nothing beats, by the way, a good impact, whether it's air. I do have an air impact or an electric like this. It's tough to beat these tools for this kind of work. Now what we're going to try to do is get this rotor off, this flywheel rotor. There's another washer right there, flat washer. Right there. Figure out how to get this rotor off. Now sometimes you can just smack the end of that crankshaft and this will pop off. That would be ideal. I don't know whether that's going to happen here, but let me get my puller and get my hammer together and we'll see if we can't get this off. I do have the correct puller to pull this flywheel off. These setup, this is pretty standard. I've used this puller on many different bikes. Not all of them, these small bikes are identical, but many of them across the brands use a very similar setup. Inside of right here, and I know you probably can't see that very well, but inside of right here, there is an internal thread. That's a left-hand thread that this part of the puller threads into. So to turn it in, I thread it the opposite of what you might think, because that's left-hand thread. You want to back the center bolt out all the way, or a lot of the way, so that you get some depth here, because the inside of this obviously has to fit over that stud sticking out of the end of the, protruding from the end of the crankshaft. And the idea is that once you thread this outer larger section in with a left-hand thread, like that, you tighten this bolt down, the internal bolt, and the intention is to leverage against the end of the crank and to pull this flywheel off. That's the idea behind it. A couple of things to keep in mind. Get this, if you buy one of these, and these are readily available. You can go online and find these on eBay. Almost any motorcycle shop can get them for you if you don't have one and you want one. I would recommend using this versus rigging up something with bolts and nuts and screws. Now, if you have to do that, you do. I've done it myself in unique situations where this wasn't appropriate, didn't work for that particular application, but I highly recommend getting a puller if you can that will fit your application. Again, this is pretty standard. I'll put a little oil on here and thread this all the way in and then put a wrench on these flats, and I will tighten it in as far in as I can on these threads. This is a fine thread, by the way. It often helps to put a washer or something similar over the end of this crank here, this stud, to allow this bolt not to, what you don't want to do is damage the end of that. And you could use just a regular washer, flat washer that will fit over here when you put it together, or something similar. Even a piece of brass would work. The brass probably would get crushed. But I like to use a washer in here to act as a separator between the end of the crank and this hardened bolt. First thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to reheat this again, like you just saw me do with the nut. I'm going to reheat this assembly really good and hot. It's cool. It's warm right now, but it's cooled down. I'll reheat it. Then the first thing I'm going to do is try using my mallet here, my brass hammer, and just smacking the end of that crank a few times. If this flywheel has been off, this rotor has been off, which I suspect it has, I don't know why else anyone would have removed this previously. This might just pop off if I smack it with a dead blow brass hammer. If it doesn't, then I can resort to the puller. But first, I need to heat this up. All right, I've got this all good and hot. It's too hot to touch. Now we're going to just smack the end of that bolt a few times and see the crank and see if this flywheel rotor comes off. And it's not. So that means we're going to have to, that's not surprising by the way, we're going to have to resort to using our puller. So I'm just going to take a little 3-in-1 oil, put a few drops on here. And then thread this in again. Remember, this is a left-hand thread, as you can see there. I did clean out the threads as best I could, the internal threads. And I will use a wrench. These flats on here, by the way, happen to be 13/16 imperial. So obviously this tool was made for the North American market. Tighten that in there as far as I can. Like that. Pull this out and put a washer in here. Just about any washer to do. I just fished around and found this small little washer that's just about the right size. I think you can see there, fit over the end of that shaft. I'm going to put a little grease here. 2 reasons: to hold the washer in place so it doesn't fall off on me, and to act as a lubricant. If that wants to turn, it's free to do so. I'll just turn that in until it bears against the end of that. Oh, look at that. It did come loose. I'll be done. I was not expecting that. I guess when I smacked it with a hammer, it came loose, and I just realized something. I got to take this cover off before I can get this flywheel out because it hits right here on these bosses. I guess I didn't realize that. Again, I haven't ever worked on this engine before, but smacking that with a hammer obviously worked. That wasn't what I was expecting to have, but it does occasionally occur. Let me just talk you through what I would do now, though, if I had to try to pull this off. Some people will put an impact on here. I probably wouldn't initially if I was trying to tighten this bolt down to pull that flywheel off. I would probably just use a wrench or a socket and tighten it slowly. And it was giving me trouble. In other words, I couldn't seem to get it to pop loose. Then I would use an impact as my next step to turn that bolt in and try to pop that flywheel off. Quite often when they do come off, if they've been on for years, many years, decades, and don't want to come off, they will come off with a bang, and it'll scare the bejeebus out of you. So in this case, it was loose and I didn't realize it. You can see that right there. So I don't need this. But what I do need to do is change gears now. Let's go ahead and take this out. I need to change gears now. The magnet, so it's attracted to the magnet in that washer, so I'll fish that out later. What I need to do now is get this side cover off so that I can get that flywheel off. And that was quite a pleasant surprise that I had to horse around with that flywheel. It came loose obviously when I smacked it with a hammer. Should be pretty straightforward to pull this cover. There's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, looks like there's 4 screws. They're holding this cover on. I've got a little piece of plywood, see here, wedged up underneath the center part of the case just to elevate this up off the tabletop. I've got my impact driver set up here in reverse with an appropriately sized bit that fits into these screws. And again, I'm not expecting to have any trouble getting these out, but we'll see how this goes. And they came right out. My screwdriver right here. Well, there's the cover. I'm pretty sure this has been off before. This is part of the clutch mechanism. You see the clutch rod right here. Goes through to the other side of the engine, protrudes through that seal right there. Neutral switch here, and there's that little washer right there. And there's the flywheel. That came off quite easily. Now there should be a key in here somewhere, right there. See that key at the top? And that fits into that slot right there. So that's keyed for positioning purposes. Let me go ahead. I'm going to clamp this up in my soft jaw vise, and I'm going to remove this puller here because I did, as you saw, tighten that in, and I'm not going to be able to get it out without holding this securely. So let me go do that. We'll come back. So I got the puller removed from the flywheel again. That was a real pleasant surprise, and I didn't see that when I smacked that with the end with that mallet. I did not see this move at all, but clearly it was loose enough that it maybe just a little pressure from the puller just freed it up, and I can get it off. Still a little warm to the touch, not hot, but good and warm. And again, this puller is extremely handy to have, and in some cases, even with this puller, I've really had to work hard at getting those flywheels off without damaging the end of that crankshaft, which you want to do at all costs. You want to protect the end of that crank and those threads. That's what this is really designed for. Now we're going to go ahead and get that key out of there, that flywheel key right in there that I just talked about, and I'm just using a small screwdriver and see if I can't leverage it out like that. I think you can see it, and I'll put that with the flywheel, and I will put that aside, and I will secure those together in a bag of some form to keep those together. So now let's study where we're at a bit. Here's the ignition and lighting system right here. Looks like there's 3 screws that hold this assembly together, or on, and you pull these 3 screws, and this probably, very likely, this whole assembly with this wiring loom just comes right off. The countershaft sprocket, the drive sprocket right here, obviously this has been off before, I can tell. That is not factory. Neutral switch we already talked about, and I'll have to loosen this off to get the wiring out, and then eventually here the oil pump will come off of this side as well. So what I'm going to do next is take a few photos of all of this, take my time and document this in photos of how it looks right now, and then we'll pick up this assembly on the other side of that.